Waldorf education started in 1919 in Germany with Rudolf Steiner, and he had an approach that saw human beings as moral, soul, spiritual beings, but not of any one particular religion. So in the public school system, we're looking at who the human being is standing in front of us. But in a Waldorf school, we have the additional plus of having permission from parents, from our pedagogy, from the community, including the students, to really think about them as spiritual beings, as well as physical, practical beings here in the world, which allows us, I think, much more like some of the religiously infused schools, to take up this issue of character in a very direct and easily approachable way. So in our school, we teach character and who you are as a human being directly in our curriculum. We talk about these issues in our literature curriculum, where we teach Faust and Parsifal, the Transcendentalists. We talk about it in our science curriculum when we teach evolution. Is there actually a difference about a human being that has this spiritual element to it? We teach it when we do cell biology. So all of this runs this existence of the human being as a spiritual being through our curriculum and allows us to talk about character all the time. Our school, like yours obviously is based, yours obviously is too, is based on relationship. We don't actually say we parent the children, but what we say is that we build an individual relationship with each child that is based on affection and care and understanding of their family environment. And so we also make decisions in the same way. What is the best for this student standing in front of me today? And our other big center to our work is connection to the world. And we do this through travel and outside experiences. We take multiple field trips. All of our students have a trip every year. Our 9th graders spend 2 weeks working on a farm together. Our 10th graders spend 2 weeks in the North Woods together. Our 8th graders, right before they come to the high school, spend a week and a half in the Canadian boundary waters area, absolutely cut off from the supports of the world, dragging canoes across large pieces of rock between lakes. Our seniors take 2 trips, one to Maine in the fall, and in the spring every year we go to Italy. Wonderful books, if anyone wants to see them at any time, of this experience for students. About 2/3 of the kids we take have never been to Europe. We are a tuition-based school, but we're not a particularly affluent community. So it's a new experience. It's a stepping out into the world before they go off to college. And 100% of our students go on to college. So we thought about 4 years ago that we had this down. It was working well. We have a very strong, coherent school. We had very few issues. And then in 2015, we experienced on almost every trip we took that year some major disciplinary issue. So we came to a realization that this central part of our school process was utterly at risk. We cannot travel around the world with 29 students if we can't trust them to do exactly what we need. We can't take kids and sleep on a farm for 2 weeks straight if they're going to leave in the middle of the night and do all kinds of things they shouldn't be doing. And so we realized that we had to fundamentally change something that was happening that had allowed them to step out and make what we felt were these mistakes. It was clear our previous system of standing around in the class before we took the trip and saying, here are the rules, just wasn't working for us anymore. We wanted, after all of these, we had some major disciplinary issues, processes. Some students were asked to leave the school. Other students went through restorative justice processes. And it was a huge amount of work and time and energy for everybody. And it didn't feel satisfying. It felt like we were headed for kind of this loop of students do something wrong, and we tamp down harder, and then we have this unwinnable. The energy of teenagers to act in ways that are less than appropriate from our perspective is huge, much larger than the energy of a faculty to hold them in. And so we had to get out of this push-pull. We just had to. We wanted to support the growth of character and healthy decision-making. A central part of Waldorf education is moral autonomy. It really is giving them space and room to learn and make mistakes and learn from them and become really capable of making strong moral decisions. But we had to come to a way of doing this that was strong enough that they didn't make major mistakes in these situations where everything was so vulnerable. So what we did was we decided that we would create a behavior contract for all students going on a school trip. Now, at first glance, this doesn't sound very different to what we were doing before, just talking to them. But the core of this, we were going to base it in relationship. So we established, and you have an example actually in the back, on the back of the page that's in there. We established a contract that we worked with faculty first, then students, then parents to create. That contract goes through very clearly and kind of lays out what are the behaviors that are expected and what are the kind of major rules you cannot break. They're at the bottom. But much more important than the actual contract was how we chose to implement it in the school. And the core of that is that for every single trip any of our students now takes from 7th grade on up, they sit with me, and they all sit with me, with their parent in my office, and we spend between 15 and 20 minutes going through this contract. Now, in 9th grade, it's 15 to 20. In 10th and 11th, it shrinks down a bit because the trips are relatively predictable and contained. And then when we get to Italy again, it expands back out to a longer conversation. But the idea was to have them go through the process of rehearsing the mistakes, lack of moral responsibility that they could make on this particular trip, have the conversation in the presence of parents and me, based on the very deep relationship that I have, in the same way that you're talking about in your school, and to have them have an opportunity in my office to practice this process, make plans, and then finish by signing it. So the way it works is there's a specific one of these contracts for every trip. I think you have a hiking club example. It could be Italy in front of you. I can't remember what I did. And in it, they're very different, the contracts for different trips. The Model UN trip takes place at a big hotel, the farm trip on a farm, Italy obviously in Italy, and each one lays out the kinds of issues. The hiking club trip talks about engaging in the natural world and not bringing your phone. The Italy one doesn't discuss that because they're encouraged to have their phones and take photographs. So each one lays out very clearly the specific issues for a trip. Then, as the conversation takes place, I don't just say, have you read it? I go through everything. I put it in context. And the conversation's a little different for every student because every student's a little different. So the students that's still in 12th grade, impulsive enough that they keep walking up to their neighbors in the hall and they're still doing this as they go down the hall, that one gets a slightly different conversation than the one who is maybe a little too afraid to step out into the world. Then we talk. We have the parents join in. Whatever concerns, questions the parent has for this trip about how this is going to work for the student. After we've gone through it all and we've discussed all the different aspects, I then very directly ask the student, are you able to sign this contract and live within it for the length of this trip? And I have occasionally had a student say no. And then we have a very different conversation. I had a student that chose not to go on one trip because they really felt like they couldn't do what was asked of them. Most of the time we have a conversation, we find some ways to work with it. We have these, we've made the choice in the school to have all the conversations be with me, which in some ways is a huge burden. But what it means is that I build through 9th, 10th, 11th into 12th. This is a conversation about character and morality that is going on between us, and it includes in-school infractions because they also come to me. It includes things that they've done for others that are real strengths because I hear about them. So it's allowed us to build this ongoing process. And for students who are part of 2 or 3 clubs, they might, between 9th and 12th grade, they might take 8 or 9 trips. And we have this conversation 8 or 9 times, moving up developmentally as they grow, and also building on their experiences trip to trip. You know, I had one of these conversations with a student who was one of the ones in 2015. She's now at 11th grader going on the hiking club. She was a 9th grader at the time. And we were able to talk about what happened at that trip, why it won't happen again, and how she's going to make sure it's not going to happen again. So it's got this richness to it, and that's why it's all me, I'm afraid. It could have been any one of the core teachers, but they chose me. Our goal is to provide moral learning in a state of moral autonomy. We have been doing this now for 2 years. This is the last 5 months worth of contracts right there. They have all the details in them. Over the 9 or 10 trips now taken, 9 when I wrote this, 10 now, we have a huge number of indicators of success. The first one is we haven't had an incident. Now, I'm going to knock on wood really strongly because we work with teenagers. We all know this. We will have other. We do not feel that if we have another one, it somehow has failed. It's going to happen. This is part of the process. But it has clearly shifted what was developing in our school, which was go on the trips and basically do whatever you want to do. It's killed that instinct. The second thing is that we get extremely positive parent feedback on these conversations. I see much more of parents than I used to. I see every parent once a year in a private conversation at the least. And the parents are very aware of how well I know their kids, which is true for so many of us, but parents don't often see it. And so it's really helped parent connection to the school. There are numerous examples of teachers pulling a student aside while on a trip. And instead of having to start at the beginning, you start 2/3 of the way down the road. You say, remember the contract you signed with Dr. Owen Cruise? And they're like, oh yeah, what have I done? And then you have the conversation. So that's allowed us, that's clear that it's working for them. The students are very actively engaged in these conversations. They talk a great deal about things to me in these conversations. And we hear it from them talking to each other. Reflections from our seniors, both going to and coming back from Italy and around graduation. They're reflecting how well these conversations have prepared them for the questions that are coming as they move out into the world. And we've had a number of different pieces of input from the students about the contracts, and we just keep incorporating it. Every trip basically is a slightly new contract built upon the experience we have from the last one. So the creation and enactment of this approach has allowed us to establish clear expectations and boundaries without taking away the opportunity for students to have these experiences. We've given them a real opportunity to practice this discipline. And although it takes a lot of time to do these conversations, I absolutely am convinced it's less time than I spent in 2015 dealing with parents and upset students and everything that happens in the thing. As we move into the 3rd year of this, we are approaching the time when we'll have students who've been using it pretty much their whole high school experience who are now going on major trips. And it's going to be interesting for me to kind of see how that comes together. And one other piece, here it is. This is my reservation for next Tuesday when I fly to Italy with 29 12th graders. And each one of them has signed this contract already. And we will be in class with them on Wednesday of this week. It would have been today, but with me gone. And on Wednesday, we will hold our class conversation about this contract. They've all signed it now. They've all had their private conversations. And we will talk on Wednesday about the last piece of the contract, which I talk about in my office, but they need to process as a group, which is that part of the contract for the senior trip is that if they know of somebody else who is drinking, which is the primary concern we have, they will share it with a faculty member. And this is a very difficult one for them, as you can imagine. And so we have this conversation in the class, and we will have it on Wednesday. Thank you.